able to be existing in regular time. I'm going to talk about them from time to culture to religion to your identity and why that's important. Now, I felt for a second Krenna had peaked my lecture because we were so in tune in some of the things that she was talking about I'm going to bring up. And I guess I should mention that Krenna and also Kelsey are participants in our Zodiac Lounge frequently. So we're very familiar with each other, so do say hello to them. All right, time. Now pay attention because this is very important. How you measure the experience of your life is the definition, the working definition I'm giving of time. How you measure the experience of your life. It's not about just the minutes and all these other things. It really becomes about your experience. And this leads to a very important thing you must realize. This is where I started my journey with astrology. After, I left out some part of the story. After I left the ministry and became an atheist, I became an academic. I was pursuing my master's and PhD in African American Studies at Temple. So I studied with Malika K.T. Asante. And during that particular point, I also did some studies about time. So I want to share something with you that's very important to know. Who controls, or whoever controls how you look at time can control you. How you look at time is how you can be controlled. Now, there are three different ways by which we can understand time. There are natural cycles of time, right? And I want to say this is to be important. All of these are human-made concepts. The sun, if we could actually make the sun alive, and we could talk to the sun, and we went up to the sun, how old are you? The sun would have no concept of what you were talking about. It wouldn't have any way by which to measure itself. So time is something that exists in our mind. Let's get that out of the way. However, there are natural cycles of time that somehow have been inculcated into our bodies. Circadian rhythms that we know of, the same rhythms that affect lizards, that affect animals, estrus, when your cat goes into heat. There are cycles in which things happen. So there are natural cycles of time. There's human-centered notions of time, which I'll get to in a second. And there's machine-driven notions of time. Now that's very important, because machine-driven notions of time is where we're living. And you're like, well, what do you mean, Sam? Well, the reason why we say, well, time is money. Do you understand that no one said that maybe 2,000 years ago? That's a concept. Or when you say oh, you have to deal with the unforgiving minute. Again, dealing with a concept of time. Another thing to understand is now we talk about things in terms of nanoseconds. So that becomes another way by which we measure time and then measure your efficiency and worth as a human being. So it's no accident that the Industrial Revolution, where we emphasize the idea of the machine, emphasizes productivity that came explicitly tied to the person. Krenna mentioned that the sixth house is something that we tie up to our job. That is not the traditional idea of astrology in terms of that particular house, because in that sense of time, your life wasn't dictated by your job. Now your life, you do use the sixth house as description of your job because it is part of your regular routine. If you were to go up to someone 2,000 years ago and ask them their occupation, they'll be able to tell you, but what's your job? Where do you do it? Whenever it's time. I mean, you go to a particular place, I don't know, do you have to go to work now? No. They wouldn't necessarily have to do it at a particular regular hour or being paid exclusively by the hour. So that's important to understand why I'm giving this lecture, because as a people, the more you're hooked into someone else's notion of time, the less you have control of your life. It's that fundamental. So where does this come from? I'm going to go through this very briefly because we can't go into everything, but I want to talk about the traditional idea of time based on what we understand about Africa. So here's an example. How many of you have heard of CP time? CP. Also known as colored people's time. Now, those of you who know or have been to the Zodiac Lounge or or been with us, I'm going to tell you the honest to God truth. I don't deal with CP time. I try to run on time. However, CP time does have an ancestral root that's very important for us to understand as we're approaching astrology. Now, I mentioned some measure of the Dogon, and the Dogon are people in what we call now Burkina Faso and in Mali. And these particular people, they're the people who were able to kind of track the development of Sirius, which is a star. So it's one of the brightest stars in the heavens. And they're the ones who were able to see that it's an actually tertiary star system, meaning that it has 3 other stars that go around what seems to be a big star. Okay? So they knew this before Europeans even knew it was a binary star. But what's important to understand about their conception of astrology and their conception of time is that they looked at time differently. They looked at time as potential time, which was inevitable, circular, it was always from the past. See, we have a notion of time that is a constant forward motion. It is vertically always going forward. But the classical notion of time always viewed it as a cycle. So no one just talked in terms of years. You were born during the particular year of the rains. You were born during a particular year of a drought. You weren't born like, well, that's why we have trouble in some countries when we ask like, well, what year were you born, sir? I don't know. It's like, but I was born during the time that the white man came. Right? Now we don't have anyone alive who's saying that, but that gives you an idea. Because people didn't go and mark things by a complete break in time going forward. It was always cyclical. So actual time was what was present and what we dealt with in the now. And all of that, whether we were talking about the cycles or the present, was activated by being human, by your humanity first. Now what does that mean? So if there was time for a ritual during one of these cyclical periods, then the ritual began when everyone was present for the ritual to begin. It wasn't about like, well, the ritual should be at dawn, or the ritual should be at dusk. Okay, about dusk, and when everyone has kind of come together, then we'll kick it off. We still have that practice. We just don't realize it. And it happens whether you're in Brazil, whether you're here, whether you're in Burkina Faso, you're in Nigeria. If you say we're going to do something, it happens when there is enough congressional energy, a congress of energy of people who get together for that event to begin. It was human-centered. We don't live in that same sense of time. But this is the classical notion of time, and that's what I meant by human-centered notions of time. So, what is astrology? Well, astrology goes with the idea that everything has a season, just like we have from the Bible. But people like to ask me, do you believe in astrology? And then, I told you, I'm in touch with my inner whatever. And I say, like, do you believe in English? I use astrology like people use their language. You don't have to believe in English to use it. So it's there. So, like anything else, it's all around you. And let me just give you a quick illustration of how it's all around you. What day is it, by the way?
It's a Sunday.
That's the day. What's the day? Sunday. Sunday. What's tomorrow?
Monday.
Monday. Okay. Go on. Tuesday. What's that? That's a Mars day. If you know Spanish, you know it from Spanish. Martes, right? And then for Wednesday, miércoles, right?
Mercury, right?
And then we know jueves for Thursday. And viernes, Venus day. And Friday, right? All right. And then we have Saturdays for Sábado. That's the Sabbath. But Saturday we have it still in English as Saturn's day. There's a reason for that. There's a reason for their order, which I hope we get to. But I just want you to understand, that comes from astrology. The calendrical science, how we understand and divide things in terms of month and years, whether you're Islamic or whether you're Jewish, comes from astrology. The holy days, which we call holidays, relates to things from astrology. The Sabbath. Now, I for people who might be very traditional in terms of religion, I'm going to have something historically maybe heartbreaking for you. The Jews got the idea of the Sabbath from the Babylonians when they were in exile there. They didn't have that in their religion beforehand. So the Sabbath came from something that was explicitly astrological. What was that? So the moon, you know, many of you know that there are 4 cycles that most of us use for the cycles of the moon, right? New moon, first quarter, full moon, last quarter, right? So the Babylonians, in the days between it was shifting from that cycle into something else, they just decided it would be best to chill, best to relax and not start anything new. So they implemented a Sabbath. Those changes in the moon cycle happens every week, once a week. So that was the period when the moon was shifting, you were supposed to rest. Because what was the moon doing? Chilling and changing. So you were supposed to chill. That's where we have the Sabbath. The Saturn's day going to the sun's day, right? And Saturn and sun are both closures of how we deal with ending the material world. All right, so Saturn is, by the way, the planet that deals with how we establish rest. In fact, I have a name for Saturn that I use in my practice. I call him the planet sit your ass down. So Saturn is where you have to kind of sit down. So it's no accident, classically and traditionally, Saturn was viewed as the Sabbath. Okay? And then the clock. You ever wonder, or maybe your kid is wondering, we have a kid in here. You look at a clock, and someone says, well, it's go clockwise. You ever wonder when you were a kid, why is clockwise clockwise? Well, I'll tell you, it comes from astrology. We imagine that the sun, and we know literally it does come from the east, but we imagine the east is on this side, right? To your left. So, when it going to the left, clockwise is this way. So the sun rises in the east and goes toward the west. So that's why clockwise is this way, because in the horoscope, for example, we start off from the east. So that's why clockwise moves the way it does. So when people say like, well, I don't believe in astrology. You know, if I feel like pressing a button, I might say like, oh, what day is it? What about the clock? We even have it in the words we use. I'm going to constellate my ideas here. Constellate relates to stars. Disaster, when you say something is a disaster, disaster means dis is against, aster means star from Greek. Then